Throughout our explanation of the Ouija board, I've tried to explain why this tool is so complicated. When we began, we covered the tools and methods that spiritualists use that eventually led to the creation of talking boards, which then was patented and created by a toy company, which now produces the famous Ouija board. In our follow-up video, or episode 2, I thought it was important to try and understand how, why, and when the Ouija board started to gain its evil reputation. It all started with the supposed possession of a boy in Washington, D.C. in 1949. The 13-year-old boy under the pseudonym Robbie Doe reportedly became possessed after an altercation or a seance with a Ouija board. And although the Ouija seance was never a confirmed, solid part of the story, a man named William Blatty in college around Washington, D.C. found inspiration in the story of the supposed possession. This inspiration led Blatty to publish a book that is basically a dramatic retelling of the story under the name The Exorcist. In The Exorcist, which was published in 1971, Robbie is replaced by a 12-year-old girl named Reagan. Early into the story, Reagan uses the Ouija board and accidentally gets possessed through the Ouija board. An entity who refers to himself as Captain Howdy is the one that's supposedly possessing Reagan, which causes Reagan to do some pretty heinous acts, including murder. At the end of the story, she is actually cured of the possession and is released from the demon. In 1973, which was only 2 years after the book's release, a film of The Exorcist was released in the United States. Now, unlike the novel, the film adaptation was a smash hit, not only because the story's plot was well developed and written well, but also because the film genuinely terrified people and scarred people. Also, unlike the novel, the Ouija board's involvement in the film had a much more profound impact since audiences could physically see the Ouija board, and that was the device which led to a brutal possession of a otherwise innocent 12-year-old girl. In the last episode, I spoke about the appearance of the Ouija board in the film being what made the board start to become perceived as evil, and even though The Exorcist was not the first, nor even near the last film to ever paint the Ouija in a negative light, it was the one that had by far the most impact on the Ouija board itself. After the film's release, many people started to report having negative or threatening communications through the Ouija board, and there was also an uptick in supposed demonic possessions after the Exorcist film came out. These aspects, rumors of the Exorcist film itself being cursed, and the Ouija getting heavily denounced by multiple denominations of the Christian faith, gave it its evil reputation. So basically, since the film was perceived as evil, and the Ouija in the movie is what released that evil, the Exorcist movie by proxy made the Ouija board evil too. However, I want everyone watching this to kind of ask yourself, does the perception of the Ouija board as evil inherently make the board evil? That question is what will pretty much be the main focus of this third and final episode, because we're going to look at some other aspects and stories and ideas surrounding the Ouija board that may have you think that this board could possibly be misunderstood. But before we get too far, did you know that over 90% of my viewers aren't subscribed to the channel? If you're new here or you find yourself coming back on the regular, why not subscribe? That way I know you all enjoy the videos. It really helps me out. That tells me that you all like the videos. And yeah, it helps me and you. And if you're coming back on the regular, why not subscribe? But without further ado, let's get into the video. When the board began its shift from an innocent parlor game that was more used for fun and for parties, into a full-fledged demon communication device, many entities started to make their presence known through the board, but one in particular reigns supreme above all else. That spirit is known as Zozo, who calls himself basically the King of Kings of Demons, and claims to be the best, I don't even know if best is the right word to use there, but the reigning demon of the Ouija board, and he's possibly the most horrible entity you could ever meet while using the board. According to multiple testimonies and experiences, Zozo is a sadistic demon who revels in the fear, pain, and suffering of every user he speaks to through the board. Additionally, Zozo has a trickster-esque mentality about him, in which he pretends to be another or multiple other entities at once. He especially enjoys mocking people's dead relatives, or rather, not mocking them, but mimicking them, pretending to be them, because, a lot of people will use the Ouija board to try to contact deceased relatives. He will intentionally mimic them to, in essence, make you lower your guard and then switch back to his evil nature to really strike you even harder than before. Beyond trickery, Zozo also takes pleasure in targeting people specifically. During sessions, Zozo will direct his attention to specific members of the group who are using the board and begin poking and prodding at their insecurities and fears, and will often even try to start predicting the day that you're going to die. Of course, if you're using the board alone, which by the way you should never do, you should never use the Ouija board alone. Obviously, if you're using it alone, he will focus entirely on you. Unlike a vast majority of spirits that you see come through the board or, have accordingly talk to people, Zozo seems pretty well aware of his form as a demon or a spirit, as a malevolent entity. Whatever he is, he seems acutely aware of his position and uses his power of being in that position to do all these horrible things to you. Those who have dedicated their lives to trying to understand what the Ouija board really does, or have had the misfortune of contacting Zozo through the board, suggest that if you believe for any reason, you should end the seance if you believe you're talking to him. It's not worth the risk. It's just best to hit the goodbye and then go on. However, since Zozo seems acutely aware of the world around him, and often pretends to be other spirits, it can be kind of hard to discern whether or not you're actually speaking to him. Additionally, not only will he intentionally mimic other spirits or pretend to be other spirits, he will sometimes take over seances with the Ouija. You could be having a perfectly normal Ouija communication with an innocent seeming spirit, and then all of a sudden it almost is like Zozo himself comes in, kicks that more, I guess, neutral spirit off of the board and will take over in its place and start doing what he does. If the idea of him kicking other spirits off the board, it's hard to know if actually he's just doing that to make a big show out of it, and he in fact was both spirits at the same time, because he likes to do that as well. Fortunately, there are some pretty telltale signs to know whether or not you're actually speaking to Zozo, and it's best to pay attention to them when you're using the board. Since Zozo takes pride in himself, he often will tell you his name if you ask it, because he loves to be known to be to have been the one to mess with people. He loves being known as this trickster aspect, but sometimes there will be slight variations in his name. So sometimes he'll be Zozo, other times he'll be Zuzu, Zaza, or Pazuzu, which we'll talk about again later. But it's best to, if you talk to any spirit and it has a Z, it's Z vowel, it's best to just not talk to it and just hit that goodbye and end this session as soon as possible. Other times, he will try to make it a lot more difficult to figure out who he is, by either using random names, or like I said, he'll pretend to be other people. He might say you want to talk to your deceased grandfather or grandmother or something. He will intentionally use that name to get in with you, basically make you lower your guard, and then, like I said earlier, he will start attacking you once you have your guard down. So, even no matter if you think you're having an innocent communication with an entity or what, you have to pay attention to the world around you the entire time while you're using the Ouija board, which is Zozo. When Zozo appears, often people say there's a sense of dread and fear that overcomes them, and it's almost like the walls around you start closing in on you. So if you feel like that at any point during the seance, whether it's Zozo or another demon or whatever you're talking to, it's best just end the session, get out of there, don't try to communicate with it anymore. Also, people say that during Zozo seances, usually the planchette, when you set your hand on it, it moves very rapidly around the board, like almost aggressively fast. Now, Zozo is not known to attach to people like the way spirits are usually thought to attach to people. Instead, he seems most comfortable within the Ouija board itself. Like, that's his home. That's where he wants to be. But once you acknowledge him through the board, it's basically like you're in his home and you're acknowledging him. He knows he knows that he's there. So once you communicate with him and you refer to him, he will constantly try to interject in every seance you have with the board from then on out. Also, Zozo does not typically manifest within the real world like I guess like poltergeist activity, paranormal activity, because like I said, he usually likes to stay in the board. But in some rare cases, people have reported hearing disembodied voices around their houses and just that aura of dread and fear that I talked about earlier. But for the most part, it seems pretty rare that happens after a Zozo encounter. But also, it's important to tell you all that because Zozo never really adheres to a certain set of rules. So, like I said earlier, I've said it multiple times now in this section, if you think for any reason you're talking to Zozo, it's best to just end the seance, don't refer to him, don't speak to him, don't do anything, just end it and go away. However, given everything we just discussed, you might be curious about the legitimacy of the Zozo phenomenon. Before I began this series, I completely dismissed the idea of the Zozo phenomenon because so many paranormal-based reality shows, or, yeah, I guess I said that right. A lot of the paranormal shows had kind of heavily diluted his name, and I kind of thought it was brought up so much that it couldn't possibly be real. But upon doing my own research and digging into experiences people had outside of, Zach Bagans and stuff like that, I found it very interesting, the rise of these Zozo interactions, and it made me curious about the possibility of his existence. Despite Zozo's rumored power and hold within the world of demons or the realm of demons, he's relatively new in the study of demonology. For example, the first mention of Zozo comes from a 19th century novel called The Infernal Dictionary. In the novel, Zozo, along with two other minor demons, possess a young girl. Later in the story, it's revealed that the girl was lying about the possession, which meant that Zozo never really even existed. After his brief appearance in the Infernal Dictionary, Zozo wouldn't really appear again until the late 1970s. Earlier, we discussed how Zozo is a demon of many names. Now, two of those names, Zuzu and Pazuzu, should have set off a few alarms if you watched part 2 of this series. If you did watch part 2 of this series, you'll know I spent a large portion of that video discussing The Exorcist and how it had such a profound impact on the story. Or, not the story, but it had a profound impact on the idea of the Ouija board and why the Ouija board is now known as evil. One of the most impactful parts of that entire movie or story is the idea of the demon Pazuzu. Pazuzu, who is a real-life Babylonian and Assyrian entity, or deity, is revealed early in the story and accidentally released upon the world, eventually possessing Reagan. However, the most crucial part is how Pazuzu came to possess Reagan. Early in the film, Reagan admits to using a Ouija board to speak to an entity she calls Captain Howdy. Of course, in reality, Captain Howdy is actually Pazuzu, and at first, Captain Howdy appears pretty harmless, and because of that, Reagan completely lets her guard down and is eventually possessed by Captain Howdy or Pazuzu. So, to quickly recap, Pazuzu first appears to Reagan as a friendly character, or Captain Howdy, to earn her trust, possesses her, and then goes on to cause pain and misery to everyone around her. Minus the possession aspect, Zozo and Pazuzu sound pretty similar in what they do and how they act. So, that kind of begs the question. Did Zozo being mentioned in early demonology, and eventually the idea of Pazuzu coming through the Ouija board, accidentally merge both of them into one entity? Now, in simpler terms, I mean, could Zozo just be the real-life version of Pazuzu as in the film? If you just take into account the descriptions and behaviors of both the entities, it seems pretty easy to say that, yeah, Zozo is most likely inspired by the idea of Pazuzu through the film. But does this immediately make Zozo a fictional story? While I can't say for sure, many swear that Zozo is real and as dangerous as described. Furthermore, if you believe in demons similar to Zozo or Pazuzu, you'll know that they're usually liars and tricksters who are pretty much willing to do and say anything to torment you. Given this, the entity using the name Zozo might literally just be using that name because it has connections to old demonology and because of the movie Pazuzu that is seen. From a more skeptical view, it is possible that people who have surface level knowledge of demonology and are familiar with the Exorcist film might have inadvertently and subconsciously made an entity called Zozo that is basically just a creation of their own mind that's tormenting them. To strengthen that idea, Zozo didn't really start reappearing until The Exorcist started becoming available on VHS in the 1980s. Now that we have thoroughly examined the idea of Zozo and sinister entities coming through the Ouija board, you might be curious as to whether or not non-malicious entities could come through the board. Well, according to people like Jane Roberts, the answer is an unquestionable yes. Jane Roberts was born in Albany, New York on May 8, 1929, and at a young age, Jane's parents divorced, with Jane's mother Marie gaining full custody of her. Unfortunately, around this time, Marie started showing signs of rheumatoid arthritis, which made it virtually impossible for her to work anymore. Due to this, Marie and Jane both moved into Marie's parents' home, which was located in a poor neighborhood. Jane's grandfather, Joseph, could not support all 4 people living at the house and had to go to get public assistance. Then in 1936, Jane's grandmother was killed in a car crash, and a year after, Joseph moved out of the house. Soon after, Marie became entirely bedridden, with Jane, who was under 10 at the time, as her sole caretaker. Also, around this time, Marie became very bitter towards Jane, blaming her for her condition and also for their financial struggles. Eventually, she disowned Jane and refused to recognize her as her daughter anymore. According to Jane, Marie attempted suicide multiple times, and after her 5th attempt, Jane walked to the welfare office and told the clerk that she could not stay with her mother anymore. Around 1940, Marie was hospitalized and Jane was placed in a Catholic orphanage. Jane took very quickly to the church and expressed that the love of the church was the most potent love she'd experienced in her entire life. In 1947, Jane began attending Skidmore College in Saratoga Springs, New York, and graduated in 1950 with a poetry scholarship. At this time, Jane had recently married a man named Walt, whom she met in college. Jane was also picking up odd jobs at the time and had a job as an editor in the Saratoga newspaper. Not much is known about Jane and Walt's marriage, but in 1954, while attending a party, Jane met a former commercial artist known as Robert Butts. Jane and Robert already knew each other, but Jane confessed to Robert that she was planning to divorce Walt and leave town. Jane offered Robert to come with her, to which he agreed, and the two later married that year in December 1954. Additionally, they moved to Pennsylvania, and while in Pennsylvania, Jane worked as a freelance writer until 1960, when she and Robert moved to Elmira, New York to find part-time work. Now, Robert picked up a job at a local greeting card factory, while Jane picked up a job at a local art gallery, but Jane, now in her early 30s, was about to have a life-changing and mind-altering experience. On the evening of September 9th, 1963, Jane sat at her kitchen table intending to work on poetry. However, as she began her work, she claimed that the world around her seemed incredibly thin, and she witnessed many alternate realities and dimensions. Jane likened this experience to an LSD trip, despite never having used any illicit substances. And following this unusual episode, Jane tried to document everything she had witnessed. Her notes were later titled and published under the name The Physical Universe as Idea Constructions. Although Jane had written stories about reincarnation, clairvoyance, and other spiritualistic concepts, she did not really believe in those ideas. However, after her experience, she started recollecting her dreams, some of which were even precognitive. Robert suggested that Jane should consider writing a book on extrasensory perception, but Jane was uncertain about how to recreate the experience she had. In need of a new way to access the realm of the unknown, it led her to consider using the Ouija board to connect with alternate planes and realities. In late 1963, Jane and Robert began using the board to explore the unknown for Jane's book. Initially, they received messages from entities claiming to be Jane's grandparents and other seemingly simple communications. However, everything changed on December 2nd, 1963, when a male entity who preferred the name Seth made his presence known. Seth made claims about his true nature, asserting that his spirit was pure energy and no longer required a physical form to function. He also stated that Jane and Robert's physical forms were only a fraction of their spiritual essence and had experienced multiple reincarnations. After these revelations, Seth requested that they hold a seance every couple of days to establish communication, to which both parties agreed. As the sessions progressed, Seth displayed a particular interest in Jane. After the initial sessions, Jane began hearing Seth's voice in her mind. After about 7 or 8 sessions, Jane transitioned to solely using the board to open the communication with Seth, but then after that would speak the messages out loud, while Robert would write all the messages down. Jane and Seth's connection grew stronger, leading Jane to stop using the board altogether. She then allowed Seth to temporarily control her body, making it easier for him to convey his messages. Witnesses noted that whenever Seth was present, Jane's facial features and voice would usually change. As time passed, Jane began questioning Seth's true nature. Was he genuinely an entity of pure energy, here to give knowledge of the unknown, or was he perhaps a subconscious construct of Jane's mind? After about the 25th session they had, Jane and Robert decided to share a transcript of a session with a psychologist to get his perspective on Seth's nature. A few days later, the psychologist informed the couple that Jane's fluency during these so-called channelings likely pointed towards a subconscious origin. While Jane had always been skeptical about Seth's nature, this revelation did still upset her. At this point in her life, Jane had distanced herself from the church and had no belief in gods or demons, which actually made it easier for her to accept that Seth was a subconscious creation. However, Jane believed that even if Seth was a creation of her mind, it didn't diminish whatever messages he had. She said on multiple occasions that her creativity and her writing both improved whenever Seth was present. While she was sometimes concerned about Seth as a product of her mind and the potential risks of that, she always described him as a mature voice that always helped her. Throughout the rest of her life, Jane gave lectures and taught about Seth and the subconscious, often free of charge, which is not something that is not usually something that people in the paranormal community do, even if they are true believers, is do stuff for free. So I thought that was pretty cool that she was giving these ideas for free. But the concept of Seth as this all-seeing entity of pure energy did fade away over time, but Seth remained stronger than ever for Jane, even as a product of the subconscious. Jane maintained her affection for Seth until the day she died, and while she embraced his true nature, not everyone shared her view. Many within the Christian community strongly disapproved of Jane for her writings about Seth. Some went to the extent of claiming that Seth was a demonic entity that had possessed Jane and attributed every piece of material she had ever worked on to the work of a demon. On the other side, non-religious individuals believe that Seth is, or some non-religious individuals believe that Seth is a legitimate entity and, in fact, not a product of the subconscious. Both before and after Jane's death, people have claimed to have met Seth through the Ouija board, and Jane actually would ask Seth about this, and Seth always claimed that he had never contacted anyone else but her. The ideas associated with Seth and Zozo make it very evident that the Ouija board is more complex than some might believe, and whether these entities are genuine spirits or products of people's subconscious, they undeniably have the potential to influence the world around them. Now, that influence can either be positive or negative, but Seth and Zozo are only two components of the larger Ouija board puzzle. Whether you have a long-standing interest in the paranormal or are relatively new to the world of the unknown, you are likely very familiar with the paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren. For those who may not know, the Warrens were a married couple who presented themselves as experts in paranormal research and demonology, and Ed described himself as a self-taught demonologist, while Lorraine professed to being a clairvoyant and a medium. And although these two might present themselves as heroes within the paranormal world, that is all a lie, and they were never who they claimed to be. Now, typically, if you've been on this channel, you know I wouldn't so casually label someone or something as wrong or false unless I wholeheartedly believed that sentiment. In this case, I do. The Warrens were involved in some of the United States' biggest paranormal stories. Of those, one of the most notable is that of the Amityville haunting. You're likely familiar with the Amityville story if you are either interested in true crime or paranormal stuff. But to quickly summarize, in late 1974, in Amityville, New York, a man named Ronald DeFeo Jr. murdered 6 of his family members. DeFeo Jr. was later convicted of second-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison. And in 2021, DeFeo Jr. died in jail. Also, as a quick side note, it's worth mentioning that during DeFeo's trial, he actively pursued an insanity plea. Ultimately, it was denied, but the Warrens and others would use this to claim DeFeo was urged on to commit the murder because he was being spoke to by demons. Just a year after the murders, in December 1975, George and Kathy Lutz bought the house and moved in with their 3 children. Almost immediately, the entire family experienced paranormal activity. In total, the Lutz family only lived in the house for about a month before leaving the property. At some point during their stay, they reached out to the Warrens, who were known in the paranormal community at this time, but had not yet attained the status that they quite have today. In the investigation, Ed and Lorraine both arrived at the house after the Lutzes has already left. However, they closely collaborated with the Lutzes, which will be very important to speak about later, but upon arriving at the home, the Warrens immediately took some time-lapse photos of the house to kind of see if they could capture any apparitions. One notable piece of paranormal evidence is a photo they claimed showed the spirit of one of the murdered DeFeo children, but in reality it was just a snapshot of one of their assistants peeking around a corner and also probably kneeling to look like around a child's height, and he was wearing glasses, which made it look like his eyes were glowing. Instead, it was just reflection from the flash bulb of the camera. Much of what the Warrens captured at the Amityville house has either been heavily questioned or outright debunked. Despite this, the Warrens and the Lutz family both maintain that the Amityville house is the most haunted house in America. Over the years, numerous lawsuits and counter-lawsuits targeted both families regarding the case's legitimacy and the substantial amount of money that they earned from the story and the haunting. It didn't take long after that for people to realize that the Amityville haunting was just a giant scheme for the Warrens to get famous and make money, and while the Lutz family seemed to just want money out of it. There's much more to the story of the Warrens' time at Amityville, but that's a totally different story for another time. Now, you might be wondering why exactly I even brought the Amityville haunting up. Well, I bring it up because Ed and Lorraine Warren were devout believers in the evil nature of the Ouija board, yet cases like Amityville and some of their other things really cast a huge shadow of a doubt on their authenticity, despite the numerous inaccuracies and inconsistencies in the Warrens' accounts, not only in Amityville, but most of what they did. They had followers who genuinely believed in their work, and to this day, some still see them as true paranormal investigators. So despite my and many others' wishes, the Warrens do have and still continue to impact the paranormal world. Due to that influence that they have, we must still consider the Warrens' ideas on the Ouija board because they played a significant role in how the board was perceived. Due to that influence that they have, we must still consider the Warrens' ideas on the Ouija board because they played a significant role in how the board was perceived. At the time of their peak of influence and popularity, the Warrens claimed that about 75% of the cases they covered involved a Ouija board. By the way, around the release of The Exorcist, the Warrens coincidentally started investigating a lot of demonic possessions and cases involving the Ouija board. I'll let you decide what that means there. Ed and Lorraine were both devout members of the Roman Catholic Church, and while they were very outspoken on the Ouija board, they condemned any form of automatic writing or spiritual communication, anything. Their belief was that spirits contacted through these methods of the Ouija board or automatic writing were usually always non-human entities that were looking for a way to manifest within the real world. Interestingly, the Warrens had the perspective that any entity contacted through these automatic writing or communication devices had to be personally invited by the user of the item, which I just think is kind of interesting. According to the Warrens, children were especially vulnerable to demonic communication, and they likened Ouija usage to real-life drug abuse. This perspective is undoubtedly because of The Exorcist, which, as discussed earlier, significantly shaped the Ouija's ideas, and then the Warrens took that and just ran with it. So that's where we're at now. Any which way, the Warrens firmly stated that anyone either intentionally or accidentally could summon malevolent forces through the Ouija board. Ed and Lorraine spent their entire lives disavowing the Ouija board throughout their career, throughout their paranormal research days. Anytime they could, they would intentionally disavow the Ouija board, any use whatsoever, and even vilified people like Jane Roberts. They were a couple of the ones I was talking about earlier that would attack Jane Roberts because they thought all of her work was made by demons. So with that being said, obviously the Warrens thought the Ouija was an open and shut kind of subject. Any communications or entities associated with it were deemed evil. They were deemed the work of the devil. They were even related to, they called them the work of the legions of hell. Anything evil, it just, no matter what you talk to through it, is always evil. So, while The Exorcist introduced the idea of demons originating from the board, the Warrens solidified this as their idea and just ran with it. Similar to their approach with many subjects they covered, they endorsed their own beliefs, vilified anyone that had differing views than theirs, and made it all about themselves, essentially. Throughout the series, we've explored skeptics' perspectives on the Ouija board, considering factors like the ideomotor effect and the subconscious appeal that may lead users to convince themselves of spiritual communication inadvertently. In this episode, we delved into experiences of Jane Roberts, who believes she communicated with the mostly neutral entity Seth. Now we also understand the Warrens' stance on the board as well, which regrettably, as I said earlier, does have pretty large influence on the perception of the Ouija board. However, among all of these individuals, I wouldn't label them as experts on the Ouija or the spirits that the board might possess. But given the complex nature of the Ouija board itself, we may require someone as complex as the board itself. In October 1875, Aleister Crowley was born in Warwickshire, England. His parents, Edward and Emily, were both evangelical Christians and were very wealthy due to Edward Sr.'s share in a family brewing business. Early in his life, Crowley began questioning his faith and Christianity and would often argue with his religious teachers over the authenticity of the Bible. In addition, he would commit acts intentionally that he knew were taboo for the church. Because of this, Crowley's mother began referring to him as the Beast, and while you think that may be harsh for a mother to do, Crowley loved this name and would actually carry that nickname on until the day he died. So, in 1895, Crowley began attending Cambridge University to study philosophy. During his time there, Crowley claimed to have his first magical or mystical experience, which was likely in his own way describing his first homosexual encounter. This marked the beginning of Crowley's bisexual lifestyle, which he would carry until the day he died, and he began a relationship with a male peer at Cambridge, but the two eventually separated when Crowley began becoming deeply involved in the practice of Western esotericism. So, to avoid being here until I pass away, and to avoid making myself go crazy, I'm going to kind of quickly sum up what esotericism is because I don't have time to explain it. In the simplest terms possible, esotericism is the belief in belief in hidden or mystical knowledge, which has to often be taught through spiritual teachings, rituals, or mysterious traditions such as alchemy and mysticism. Also, it kind of is just a blanket word that refers to any form of magical knowledge that's not widely understood or known by the general public. In 1897, Crowley decided to commit to a life of the occult fully, and shortly after that, despite performing near the top of his class, he dropped out of Cambridge, and in 1898, Crowley joined the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which is usually also just known as the Golden Dawn, was a secretive and influential occult society formed in the late 19th century, and its main focus was to study and practice Western esoteric traditions such as Hermeticism, Kabbalah, astrology, and ceremonial magic. And no, I'm not going to describe any of those. Crowley's intelligence and sort of political background allowed him to quickly climb the ranks of the Golden Dawn, which was to the detriment of many other members of the Golden Dawn. This disdain was actually mostly fueled by Crowley's bisexuality, and also a lot of the other members believed that Crowley had a severe lack of morality, which, yeah, they were right. Also, as a quick side note, because I just have to bring this up, in 1899, I always keep wanting to say 19, in 1899, Crowley took up residence near Loch Ness, and yes, that Loch Ness. And although it might not directly relate to our story of the Ouija, I just have to bring it up that one of the most quote-unquote magical figures to ever live also lived off of the shore of the home of Nessie. I just have to bring it up. In the early 1900s, Crowley began traveling abroad, studying various cultures and religions, engaging in numerous affairs, contracting multiple diseases, and generally being a nuisance to everybody. And in August of 1903, he married a woman named Rose Kelly. In 1904, both Crowley and Kelly claimed to receive messages from supposed higher beings, and according to Crowley, these entities proclaimed that he was to be a new prophet and lead the next generation of humanity. Additionally, the spirits instructed Crowley to establish a new moral law. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. These words would become the foundational principle on Crowley's new religion, Thelema. Similar to how I covered esotericism, I'll quickly summarize Thelema as best as I possibly can, because I don't fully understand it. You probably don't care that much. So, and while the idea of Thelema is not super important to the Ouija board, and I know that's the subject of our video, it is crucial to Crowley's story, which then in turn is crucial to the Ouija board, so I have to talk about it. From what I understand, Thelema is basically the idea of discovering and understanding one's true will. And according to Crowley, true will is within everyone, but is not humanity's ordinary wants or needs. From what I got, it's described as something that already exists within every person, and whatever the person's true will is basically like it's like their calling, from what I understand. And like I said, I'm not an expert on this. Like I said, you probably don't even care, but I just have to talk about it, so hopefully that's correct. The foundation of Thelema essentially marks the climax of Crowley's life. It's the climax of his life because nearly everything afterward was downhill for him. Over the next few decades, Crowley continued to travel abroad, but much of that was due to forced deportation, and a lot of countries deported Crowley when they knew he was there, because during World War I, he showed support for Germany. Additionally, Crowley's habit of contracting every single disease imaginable led him to be prescribed heroin. This was the early 1900s, so of course, since it's heroin, he got addicted to it and pretty much used it till the day he died. So Crowley also became the target of multiple skeptics and smear campaigns towards the end of his life. And although Crowley seemed confident in everything he said and claimed, that confidence is what made him such an easy target, because it was super easy to provoke him. Of all these campaigns, the most damaging, and the one that persists to this very day, was the idea that Crowley was a Satanist. However, this idea and this claim was partially Crowley's fault, of course. And a big thing to understand about Aleister Crowley is that he loved to be hated. He loved to be the villain in the eyes of those who already hated him. To a majority of followers of the Abrahamic faiths who already despised Crowley, because of course they did, there was no greater villain to them than Satan. Therefore, Crowley would deliberately label himself as Satanist and claim to perform human sacrifices, which neither were ever true. He chose titles like the Beast and the Great Beast 666, but both of those were both inspired by Crowley's mother, and additionally, from a young age, Crowley denied being a Satanist because he didn't even consider the Christian faith to be true. Therefore, he couldn't even believe in Satan because he didn't accept the idea or the framework of Christianity. So, in his own mind, he couldn't even fathom the idea of Satan existing. And yes, I know Satanists don't even worship Satan, but it's kind of changed over time, so I gotta explain it that way. And Crowley passed away on December 1st, 1947, at the age of 72. But even in his death, he was not a man without controversy. On the day of his funeral, the tabloids referred to the ceremony as a Black Mass, which is basically a type of satanic ritual or ceremony. Crowley is one of those figures in history and the world of the occult that the more you read about him, the more complicated and confusing he really becomes. And whatever your feelings on Crowley are, it's hard to argue against the idea that he was a complicated man who lived a very complicated life. However, I can't go without saying many of those complications were of his own making, so you can only feel so bad for somebody. Even so, everything we just talked about, that I just told you, that's literally just surface level Aleister Crowley. And, you know, I tried my best to keep all of this as concise as possible, but even just to get that foundation down to talk about this next part, ended up being 3 whole pages of work. So, if I ever decide in the future to do a deep dive on Aleister Crowley, it'll probably be at least 50, 60 pages. And that's saying something, because this entire episode here is going off a 30-page outline. So, like the Warrens, I found it pretty essential to cover Crowley's life to understand his perspective on the Ouija board better, and to get his idea on the possibility of what spirits could reside inside the board. Unsurprisingly, Crowley had quite a lot to say about the board, given its supposed nature. Crowley took the Ouija board very seriously as a tool to access the knowledge of the unknown. However, he was adamant about the potential dangers of the Ouija, especially for inexperienced users in spiritual communication and occult practices. And according to him, the board can be used to communicate and summon creatures and entities and spirits of much higher divinity than man. Crowley insisted that the process and methods for invoking these deities were extensive and must be approached with the utmost caution. He believed that most spirits coming through the board were liars, who were often attempting to manipulate users into setting them free from the board. Crowley warned that whenever you use the board, you are surrendering your hands and your mind to whatever spirit may come through the board. And because of this, you risk manifesting that entity, or you risk being possessed by that entity. Partially, though, this is why Crowley really liked the Ouija board, is because the board requires human interaction to be able to work. Basically, the board has no power until a person puts their hand on the planchette. Of all the spirits and entities on the board, Crowley was particularly cautious about the Enochian and elemental forces. Enochians were described as angel-type figures, and although the term Enochian is derived from the biblical name of Enoch, the Enochian angels had no relation to the biblical angels. Instead, according to Crowley, they were just higher spiritual entities that could be summoned or communicated with through rituals. Now, on the other hand, elementals are lower level spirits who are associated with the four known elements, which is earth, water, air, and fire. Now, elementals are dangerous because they can shapeshift into any form they want. They're often deceitful and have that typical demonic sort of trickster nature and mentality. Now, Crowley insisted that both Enochian and elemental spirits could become very dangerous if left unchecked. Crowley recommended that if anyone was attempting to summon these forces, which I'll tell you right now, never try to do. I mean, do whatever you want, but know that there might be consequences. You know, that's the rule of life. There's consequences for our actions, but you should never try to do this. I would never recommend it. But Crowley says that if you are planning to do this, you must be very knowledgeable on the subject, or it will go very, very wrong. Additionally, Crowley believed, along with many other occultists, that you, as the user, must decide which spirit you will communicate with. If you are to use the board and open a conversation with no specific spirit in mind, you are inadvertently opening the doorway for any spirit to come through. Crowley claimed that this perspective of the board, or this aspect of the board, is what made it so dangerous. He likened it basically to, imagine if you just opened your front door to your house and just let anybody walk in. Like, just no, you don't have to check, nothing. They just walk in and there's no consequence for it. Surprisingly, much later after Crowley had already passed, Ed Warren actually agreed with this idea, even though Crowley was basically the antithesis of him and his wife. It is my opinion, and the opinion of many others, that if anyone might have a fraction of a grasp on what exactly the board is, it was probably Aleister Crowley. For all his faults, he probably knew what was going on. The man was the real deal. He believed in everything he was saying. However, him being the one that probably knows the most about the Ouija board only really applies if you believe the board is a paranormal device and not like a subconscious action or just a hoax entirely. Even then, some people who believe in the supernatural element of the board don't agree with Crowley's perspective on Enochian angels and elementals and all that. But in my opinion, the biggest question regarding the Ouija is any of this even real? Is the board simply a subconscious key, a device to speak to deceased loved ones, a device to speak to the upper echelon of mystical knowledge, or is it all just fake? If you're new here or you have been here for a while, I kind of want to explain how I consider something paranormal real, quote unquote real. In my opinion, I believe a paranormal subject becomes real if it has the power to substantially change the world around it. For example, I think the Mothman is real in the sense that it gripped the town of Point Pleasant for an entire year in the late 1960s, but I don't really fully believe in his physical nature. However, entities like the Flatwoods Monster and the Hopkinsville Goblins feel a little less real to me. The reason is that they only affected a handful of people and weren't the cause of a mass panic. Now, all of those are obviously examples of cryptids and are different from the idea of the Ouija board, yet they fall under the same umbrella of paranormal or supernatural subjects, and I personally think of the Ouija board in the same way that I think of Mothman or the Jersey Devil. The Ouija has a complicated history that goes back before the name Ouija even existed. Remember, the device itself is just actually called a talking board. The Ouija just so happened to find commercial success. Stories like that of Robbie Doe supposedly getting possessed through the use of the board, and The Exorcist causing panic over the idea of the board being able to summon demons, affected the entire world, honestly, and changed the idea of what the board could actually do. But there are even more examples of what the board has the possibility to do. In Oklahoma in 2001, a 53-year-old woman named Carol Sue Elvaker became interested in the Ouija board. During a session in early February 2001, Carol, her daughter Tammy, and her two granddaughters received a message saying that Tammy's husband Brian was evil and had to die. The board also claimed that one of the granddaughters were evil too. After the session was over, Carol calmly walked to the kitchen, grabbed a kitchen knife, entered the room where Brian had been sleeping, and plunged the knife into his chest. Unfortunately for Brian, the blow was not immediately fatal, and Brian had to sit there begging his mother-in-law and his wife for help, but both just sat there and watched him bleed out and die. And after this, Carol then tried to stab her 10-year-old granddaughter, but was luckily unsuccessful in that attempt. The 10-year-old girl and Tammy both wrestled the knife away from Carol and hid it somewhere in the house. In probably the dumbest and most entertaining part of this whole story, Carol, Tammy, and the granddaughters, one of who Carol just tried to kill, all got into Tammy's car to attempt to flee the scene. The worst part is, they let Carol Sue drive. The woman who had just murdered her son-in-law and attempted to harm one of her granddaughters was left in charge of a motor vehicle that had that same granddaughter in it. After driving for a bit, Carol took the car on the interstate heading towards Tulsa, Oklahoma. All of a sudden, as if something had overtaken her, Carol rammed the car into a highway sign in an apparent attempt to kill everyone in the vehicle, including herself. Now, I know I shouldn't laugh because someone did die from this and it's an attempted murder, but it's just, at some point you got to start thinking about, like, this old lady just killed her son-in-law and attempted to kill this granddaughter, and then they let her drive a vehicle. At some point, you just gotta laugh. And speaking of laughing, hilariously, everyone else in the car crash only suffered minor injuries, like cuts and bruises. Now, Carol broke both of her ankles. I don't even know how you do that. So, everyone, including Carol, all exited the car, at which point Carol tried to push the granddaughter, and she tried to push the other granddaughter, the one that the board didn't even mention, into traffic, but luckily was also unsuccessful in that attempt. And then, and this is what I'm talking about, sometimes you just gotta laugh. Carol stripped off all of her clothes, jumped the highway median, and ran into the nearby woods. Later, she would be found and taken to the Oklahoma Health Science Center for treatment, and she was charged with first-degree murder. To quickly recap, the night started with Carol and the women of her family playing with a Ouija board. The board then supposedly told them that Brian was evil and had to die. Carol murdered Brian, and the night ended with what I can only describe as the most fucked up episode of Looney Tunes ever imagined. During the investigation of the murder, it was discovered that Carol also previously tried to kidnap Brian's nephew because he too was deemed evil and had to die. But luckily, the boy's mother there was to stop Carol's plan. However, this pretty much made it clear to the authorities that Carol just had a disdain for Brian long before the murder occurred. A few months after the murder, Carol was found not guilty by reason of insanity and was institutionalized for the rest of her life. Tammy was initially charged with being an accessory to murder, but the charge was dropped in exchange for her pleading guilty to 3 counts of child endangerment, and all in all only served 1 year in prison. Now, the story of Carol Elvaker, even though it took place in 2001, which was 23 years ago, is relatively recent in the board's long history. However, the board began influencing people to do the unthinkable from even the early days of its life. In 1931, Ernest Hurley, his wife Dorothy, and their 2 children had recently moved from Arizona to California. Soon after their arrival, Dorothy became almost infatuated with one of their neighbors, and that was because Dorothy always had a romantic interest in cowboys and believed the new neighbor could fulfill her fantasies. Not sure what to do, Dorothy decided the Ouija board could solve all her problems. She actually convinced her 15-year-old daughter, Maddie, to perform the Ouija seance with her. Quickly, when they started the seance, the planchette quickly spelled out that Daddy must die. When they questioned who should take care of the job, the board, oh so coincidentally, said the daughter should be the one to do it. Additionally, the board noted Maddie had to promise to her mother she'd kill her father so she could have her dream cowboy. When she raised the gun, she actually hesitated, but the thought of her mother and the promise she made pushed her to pull the trigger. However, the blast of the shotgun did not kill her father instantly, and Maddie tried to play it off, saying that she had tripped and accidentally fired the shotgun. Now, when Ernest arrived at the hospital, he told the doctors the story of the accidental shooting. However, all of the doctors there were pretty skeptical, and a few days later, Ernest succumbed to his wounds. Soon after her father's death, Maddie was arrested and quickly confessed to the shooting and told police that the Ouija board told her that she had to kill her father so her mother could have her dream cowboy. For the murder of Ernest Hurley, now remember this is 1931, for the murder of Ernest Hurley, Maddie was sentenced to 6 years in a convent, but was released after 3, and Dorothy was sentenced to 10 years to life in prison, but was released after 2 years. In simpler terms, the death of a loving father and husband was justified by the shooter being required to be a nun for 3 years. The person who manipulated the shooter only served 2 years in prison because she had a crush on her neighbor who, in all honesty, seemed to have no interest in Dorothy and was just a nice person. We head to Wisconsin in 1935 for our last story. The elderly Nellie Hurd had claimed her husband Herbert had begun acting very strangely and believed he may have been having an affair. Now, this was despite the fact that Herbert was 77 years old. She felt the only way to know for sure what was happening was to consult the Ouija board. Nellie had used the Ouija board before and always believed it was correct. When she asked the Ouija if Herbert was having an affair, the planchette quickly zipped to the yes mark on the board. Additionally, when Nellie asked who he was having the affair with, it coincidentally spelled out the name of their younger, more attractive neighbor, whom Nellie had always been very jealous of. The spirits also mentioned that Herbert had apparently buried $15,000 on the property, but they didn't know where it was. Nellie fully trusted the Ouija and was shocked that Herbert could have ever done such a thing, as she believed she had done everything in her life to be the best wife possible. Nellie decided that Herbert had to be punished for doing such a thing, and similar to the story of Dorothy Turley, Nellie convinced her daughter Bertha to help with the punishment. Nellie decided that Herbert had to be punished for doing such a thing, and similar to the story of Dorothy Turley, Nellie convinced her daughter Bertha to help with the punishment. On a random day, Nellie and Bertha knocked Herbert out with the butt of a pistol, dragged him down to the house's basement, and chained him to a bed in the basement. The women then tortured Herbert in various ways, such as beating him with a whip, prodding his feet with a burning hot fire poker, and pricking him repeatedly with a dagger. On a random day, Nellie and Bertha knocked Herbert out with the butt of a pistol, dragged him down to the house's basement, and chained him to a bed in the basement. The women then tortured Herbert in various ways, such as beating him with a whip, prodding his feet with a burning hot fire poker, and pricking him repeatedly with a dagger. Herbert would obviously scream in pain and call for help, but no one could hear him from the basement, and if he ever got too loud, Nellie would just knock him out again with the butt of the pistol. Eventually, Herbert gave in and signed a false confession to appease the women, and in the confession, he admitted to having the affair and claimed to have given that $15,000 to the neighbor. Although the confession did seem to appease both the women, they still continued to keep Herbert locked up in the basement, and once Herbert actually managed to escape his chains and the cellar, but was unfortunately knocked out by Nellie again and returned back to imprisonment. Herbert actually did manage to escape again, and this time he managed to get a hold of the pistol, and in an act of revenge and honestly survival, he shot and killed his wife. So, initially for the shooting, Herbert was arrested and charged with murder, but once Herbert's told his side of the story, stating that there never was an affair and that whatever spoke to Nellie had lied to her through the Ouija board, all his charges were dropped and Herbert was released from jail. Stories like these show us that, without a doubt, the Ouija holds some power. The origin of that power is what makes it so mysterious. Stories like these show us that, without a doubt, the Ouija holds some power. The origin of that power is what makes it so mysterious. Now, these stories are just a few in the sea of Ouija-related crimes, and honestly, of the three I just told you, they all seem more influenced by the subconscious aspect than actual spirits telling these people to, hey, tie up your husband and beat him ruthlessly until he shoots and kills you. Of course, the cases that are more paranormal in nature or unexplainable are the ones that are lacking a lot of information. But, however, whether you or I believe the Ouija's power is supernatural, subconscious, or something different altogether, it can change the world around it substantially, which, by my own definition, makes it real. When I began covering the Ouija board back in July, I didn't really expect it to I didn't expect it to turn into the massive saga it kind of became on the channel. And, somewhat foolishly, I guess, I believed a device as complicated as the Ouija board would be so easy to explain. I was obviously very wrong, since this is the series' third, final, and probably longest episode. But when I first began researching the Ouija, I kind of quickly realized I was sort of out of my depth a little bit. But I almost took that as a challenge because, cryptids and ghosts and stuff that I've covered before are kind of easy. I wouldn't say easy, but they're more straightforward, I guess, than the Ouija. Because, like Mothman and the Jersey Devil, you got a time frame and you got a story to go off of. The Ouija, you don't really got that. It's got all sorts of characters in it, like, Crowley and the Warrens and whatnot. But, like I said, I kind of took that as a challenge because I want to expand what I'm doing more than just, here's a year of stuff that happened, and that's what I tell you. I wanted to do something complicated like the Ouija to kind of come out of my comfort zone a little bit. And, for better or worse, I think it worked. So, in some ways, I should have kind of assumed that the Ouija board would become a thorn in my side. Because, I'm trying to put my words together here. But, subjects that tend to dip into the occult, especially, have a tendency to become very complicated very quickly. I even talked about that in my section on Aleister Crowley. Also, as a quick side note to that, I forgot to mention earlier that Crowley apparently had an idea about making his own talking board like the Ouija, and there is actual documentation of this idea as a concept, but any design he may have had has been lost to time. Also, as a quick side note to that, I forgot to mention earlier that Crowley apparently had an idea about making his own talking board like the Ouija, and there is actual documentation of this idea as a concept, but any design he may have had has been lost to time. My thoughts on the board have changed, I would say, since I've had the Ouija board kind of sitting up in my head for over 6 months now, because before I began the series, I was one that always believed the Ouija had to possess some sort of supernatural power, and in a way, I somewhat still believe that, but I'll touch on that again later. But now, I'm more convinced the Ouija unlocks people's subconscious and reveals their truest desires and thoughts. But also, in my opinion, I think that idea is as terrifying as the paranormal aspect of the board. The possibility of a device accessing your subconscious and, in essence, causing yourself to go insane sounds as unpleasant as demonic infiltration, in my opinion. However, part of me does still kind of believe in the paranormal aspect of the Ouija board, and I'm in the realm of thought that Aleister Crowley had. Basically, don't use the board if you're not confident in what you're doing. But honestly, that logic can be applied to both subconscious and paranormal communication. If you aren't in the right state of mind or utterly aware of what you're speaking to or doing, it's probably for the best to avoid using the board. But honestly, that logic can be applied to both subconscious and paranormal communication. If you aren't in the right state of mind or utterly aware of what you're speaking to or doing, it's probably for the best to avoid using the board. Even then, I wouldn't recommend using the board because it is opening a gateway to something we don't fully understand. The idea of the unknown is what makes the Ouija as powerful and terrifying as it is. You could be talking to a deceased human spirit. You can be talking to an upper echelon deity. Or your mind could be talking to itself until eventually you kill somebody. So, in my opinion, I don't find the reward worth the risk when it comes to the Ouija board. So, while I'll always be curious about the Ouija's power, I think I'll play it safe and steer clear of the planchette. Oh, thank you all so much for making it to the end of the video. I cannot tell you how relieved I am to finally finish up the Ouija board series. Like I said in my conclusion, I wasn't expecting this to go on as long as it did, because I felt the series was both good and bad for a couple reasons. Like I said earlier, I think it was good for me because this is by far the most ambitious project I've worked on so far, which is probably not saying much because I think I'm at like 7 or 8 videos, but that means a lot for me. However, I'll actually talk about the good part again too. Before the series came around, obviously I did the Jersey Devil video, which is by far the longest video. I think it's the longest video on the channel still. This one might beat it though, honestly. But that one was a huge one for me. It ended up stretching out a longer time than I thought it would, and I never thought anything would ever touch the length of that one. But between episode 1, 2, and this one. This is by far the most covered thing on my channel so far, and I cannot tell you how happy I am to have it finished up. Because, like I said, I do think the series has had some downsides, especially episode 2. I think I did touch on it a little bit in my Headless Horseman video, but the second episode of this series, the Ouija series, kind of suffered from bad timing and my belief that I need to get videos out as soon as possible or as quick as possible. And unfortunately, I believe that really lowered the quality of that video. Because of that, I was kind of disheartened to continue doing the Ouija board. But then I made the Headless Horseman video for Halloween. You know, and that video, it took me less than 2 weeks to complete. And somewhat hilariously, that video ended up becoming one of my favorites I've ever done. And while I did somewhat rush that video too, I still loved making it because I felt it reached my standard and I enjoyed making it. And this is kind of the outlook I want to have from now on when I make my videos. Not the rushed part. If I can avoid doing that, I will. But I want to continue doing this because I feel like it's up to my standard and I enjoyed making it. And that's what I want to do from here from now on. Now, the first episode of this series, the Ouija series, was super fun to work on and make, and so was this one. I just kind of put myself in a corner for episode 2, where I both rushed myself and wasn't happy with how it turned out, but I still posted it anyways instead of going back and redoing it. Now, with the series finished, I can move on to the other things and end this series on a high note. I do already have a few ideas rattled around in my brain. Actually, when I wrote this outline, I didn't have an idea for what I'm doing next, but now I'm pretty confident in what I'm doing next. I'm not going to tell you because I like keeping it a surprise. Obviously, a couple people who know me in real life, you're going to watch this, you already know what it is. But I'm super excited about the next thing. I'm excited for things to come. A few other things I wanted to mention was my ideas for rebranding the channel again. I know I posted something like a month or so ago saying I was rebranding the channel again. Obviously, when I began the channel, I had the little Mothman character wearing the hoodie and stuff, and I still really like that character, but I'm still up in the air about whether or not I want to have a character for the channel, or if I just want it to be myself. I mean, obviously, if you're watching this video now, just a couple days ago, I changed it back to my face. It's something that I will probably kind of continue messing around with as the channel goes on and as I keep doing this. But I just wanted to let you all know why that's been happening, because I can't decide what I want just yet. Also, Happy New Year's, everyone. I don't really know when this video will be up, but at the time of recording this, we're only a few days past New Year's, and I wanted to take a minute to thank everyone who has supported the channel and thank everyone for an incredible 2023. Now, for those that don't know, I started my channel in 2022. I ended 2022 with about 30 or so subscribers, which I don't want to say that that's not a lot, because that's a lot for me. It's 30 subscribers. But at the end of 2023, we ended with over 200, which just blows my mind to think about. We went up over 150 subs, 170 subs. It just really blows my mind. If you've been here since the beginning or very early in the channel's history, I took a break back in July of 2022. Just a lot of things happened. I remember the big thing that happened. I used to have a laptop that I made these videos on. Now I have a full computer that I can work on this stuff on. That laptop broke. I ended up taking a break for the rest of that year. I took a break for the rest of that year and then still didn't return back to this until May of 2023, which was a break of over about a little, I think it was like 10, that's about 10 months. But what in the time that I was gone, I was really concerned that I had sort of lost any momentum I'd gained in the short time of doing this. But you amazing people were right there to disprove me, because when I returned with my Jersey Devil video in May, which, by the way, if I just gotta say real quick, out of all the videos I made this year, the Jersey Devil video is by far my favorite. If you have not watched that one, I really hope you go watch it. It's my favorite one I've ever worked on. It was kind of like restarting the channel, and I loved working on it, even though it took so long to get done. But when I returned with that video in May of 2023, it, within a couple weeks, became the most viewed and most liked video on the channel. Then after that, only a couple weeks after that, I made the Hopkinsville Goblins videos. For some reason, this video blew up and reached about 1,000 views in a month, which still to this day shocks me that a video of mine passed 1,000 views. And, you know, I'm sitting here now and I'm pretty sure it's over 2,000 views. I think last I checked, the Hopkinsville Goblins videos at 2,200 views. So it's just blown my mind. It continues to blow my mind. But then after that, I made the Flatwoods Monster video. And that was a themed video because I was about to go to the Flatwoods Monster Festival. Or no, the Bigfoot Festival. And all of you awesome, amazing, any word I can use to describe you all got that video past the Hopkinsville video within a week. It was and is still incredible, like I said, to see the reach my videos have had. The idea that any video I ever made would reach 1,000 views, it was just unthinkable when I started this whole thing. All of this is to say that I want to make 2024 even better. I want it to make my biggest year. Now, you know, I've only been doing this for a couple years. I've only made a handful of videos, but I want to make 2024 the year where I start taking this project seriously and start trying to make it into something special. Now, I already have a few ideas, and I received a few things for Christmas. I got some Christmas gifts that I intentionally asked for to help with some of the plans I have for this year. Nothing for now. I'm not going to spoil anything, but when the time is right, I cannot wait to show you all what I have planned. For now, I'm going to keep doing this. I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. And like I said, I will try to stop overthinking and rushing myself and just make the content I enjoy making and the content you all enjoy watching. Also, I plan to dust off my second channel sometime this year, but I'm not exactly sure what I want to do with it yet. But I have a few ideas, but none of them concrete yet, like everything I've said so far. But as always, thank you all so much for watching the video. If you enjoyed the video at all, please support the channel by subscribing or liking the video. That's the easiest way for me to know that you all enjoyed what I'm doing here, and it helps me know. It helps me know that I am doing something here. Like I said, I just want to know that you all enjoy watching this because I enjoy making it. But here's to an amazing 2024, and I hope to see you all again soon.